All right, everybody. It's probably time to get started. So I'd like to welcome you all to this final sixth session of the Data-Driven Queuing Challenges Multi-Continent Conference. So as I said, I'm sitting in Melbourne, Australia, and in Australia, it's conventional now to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we're sitting on. And I'm sitting on the land of the Wurundjeri people from the Kulin Nation, who are the traditional owners of the land around Melbourne. And I'd like to just pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. And I'd also pay my respects to the traditional owners of all the lands that people are on this call are sitting wherever they happen to be around the world. Our first speaker in the session is Melanie Reuter Oppermann, who's at Technical University of Darmstadt. I met Melanie a few years ago at conferences about emergency management services, and she's done a lot of work in this area. She's going to tell us about recent topics in EMS logistics, and when we were looking at it, we liked the pictures on her first slide. So thanks, Melanie. Take it away.
Yes, thank you so much for the kind introduction, also for inviting me to speak here. As you said, I want to talk about some recent topics in EMS logistics. And when I prepared the talk, I was thinking about a lot of things I've worked on and things that I'm currently seeing in practice as well as literature. So I had a lot more that I wanted to talk about, and also maybe more open problems than actually answered problems. So I'll try to give you kind of an overview, a little peek into some different topics, and also maybe discuss some open questions that we currently still have. And if you're interested in any of those, please feel free to contact me afterwards. A motivation for me to still work on those topics is that, especially in Germany, we see that the emergency medical service systems are overwhelmed with a high number of calls. COVID was especially challenging. A lot of people not sure what to do, where to go, calling coordination centers like really all the time. We also see, unfortunately, that ambulances are often too late. We do have fixed response time targets in Germany that differ for the federal states. It's a totally different issue why this is the case, but still we aim to be at the emergency sites usually within almost 15 minutes, and this is quite difficult to reach, especially in rural areas. And we also see that the EMS services are critically understaffed. It's not a very well-paid job. It's not very well achieved job. So we just don't have enough people to do the service, which is really unfortunate, but which also means that we need to be really efficient with the resources that we have, right? And this is where operations research can actually help. Something that's currently not really used in German practice. So there's also a huge gap between what literature says and does and what the practice does. And I've also been thinking a lot why this is the case. And I think that what we do in research is often a lot more complicated, a lot more complex from a methodology point of view than what practice can understand and use. Might also not always completely match the needs. And this is something we definitely have to work on to close this gap. If we think about EMS logistics, emergency medical services, we often think about something like this, a very easy thing. So we have an emergency that we have to send an ambulance to, maybe a helicopter if it's really remote or very critical, and then we bring the patient to the hospital. But actually, the system is a lot more complex, and it's a whole network. We do have different forms of emergency services for patients, so we do not necessarily need to send an ambulance if it's an urgent case, but maybe not life-threatening. So people could see GPs in after-hours practices. They could also, if it's during the day, go to their GP without an appointment and seek treatment. If the ambulance is far away, if it's a really critical incident, we might want to send volunteers or first responders to the scene first to perform some first aid. And then after the hospital, also a lot of other things might happen. So we might need to transport the patient to a different hospital after first care because we realize that patient needs special treatment, special care that not every hospital can provide. And then we add a whole other level about that because maybe the patient is not the person actually calling the service if the patient is really sick. So from a service perspective, the patient who's cared with is not really, or is not the only customer in our system. We might have a different caller, different people involved in that, who call the coordination center, that manage all the services, but paid, or the system is usually, or the services are paid by insurance companies in Germany. So they're the customer that pays in the service sign sense. So it's a whole complicated system leading to many different challenges planning wise, and also practical issues. What this relates to from an OR perspective often is that we have a lot of different competing objectives, because obviously insurance companies have different objectives than patients and coordination centers or other parties involved. So we need to take that into account, and also think about especially multi-criteria approaches to tackle these problems. And just from an emergency services point of view, there are a lot of different planning problems on the planning levels. This is one way of displaying them that we've published in a review paper if you're interested. And we address workforce planning, the ambulance location planning, and also some operational tasks like dispatching ambulances, maybe relocating them during the day, planning patient transports. And all this is added by planning problems that happen within the coordination center, which can be staffing, modeling calls arriving as a queuing process, for example, figuring out if it's worth splitting tasks between dispatchers or not, if call takers and dispatching should be unified in people, or if this should be separate. So a lot of very interesting problems that can be tackled here. And while research has been going on since the late 60s, there are still a lot of open topics. There are some current streams investigated in research. One is fairness within EMS services. So not only the question, how can we somehow manage to fulfill our response times, but can we also locate ambulances in such a way that people have somehow all similar access to those resources, which is contradictory sometimes to the shortest response time fulfillment. So this is also some design question that decision makers have to make, but just from an operations point of view, it's also very interesting, and it gives new ideas to think about how to design your service. Then COVID definitely had a huge impact on the system. I've already mentioned that in the motivation, but also just how we use data and what data means for our planning problems. I mean, it's all the previous calls, the previous emergencies are the data we use to plan for the future. And if this is somehow corrupted by COVID, we have to think about how to deal with it. And when we think, for example, about Germany, we have 16 federal states. They're separated in many different EMS regions, all with different geographical backgrounds. We have city regions, we have more rural regions, we have the Alps, we have seaside regions. So they're all a bit different. And one of the open topics is like if we would always choose the same location planning model for each of those regions, independent of their geographical structure, or if there's not a more clever way to do so. And I want to start with the COVID impact on ambulance location. Ambulance location is a problem I've been working on, I think, since the beginning of my PhD in 2010. And I mean, there's a vast amount of literature out there, like hundreds of papers, literally. And still German practice of how they plan in Germany is so far away from that, and so simple, and also a bit wrong in my point of view. But it's not really easy to just say, for example, let's apply a hyper-queuing model. Something that's in the literature and that's quite promising. Just an example of one of the approaches. It's just, you can't really explain that to decision makers. They can't apply such a model themselves. It's just too far away from what they know and can do. So there's a huge gap between that, and this is something I'm also struggling a bit actually to figure out a good way how to choose a model that's simple enough but sophisticated enough to do the job. And then we get the data issue. In Germany, we usually use the last 2 years of data to plan for the future. And if we do that now, which 2 years do we use? 2020 and 21, from which we know that they've been different to everything that happened before? Or do we just ignore what happened during COVID and take 2018, 2019, which is probably wrong as well? And there's currently not really an answer to that. It might be that we just also use scenarios for the future, right? That we can't just take one set of data input anymore, but we have to build scenarios for the future and use all of this in a stochastic or in a robust approach to do that. Simulation is also, I think, a very important aspect then of such a solution approach, to also see how dependent we are on, or how variable the input might be, whatever happens in the practice, and how sensitive a location might compute will be or could be to different future outcomes. And just to give you an idea, so this is one data set from one coordination center where I compared the emergency data from 2019 and 2020. And on the right, you see, for example, when there is an increase or like a positive percentage, it means that there was a decrease between 2019 and 2020. And if it's a negative value, there was an increase. So in August, we see, for example, an increase in demand, which we often see in summer. And like overall, there's a tendency of rising numbers in emergency demand in Germany. A lot of different reasons for that. But in April, for example, we had 16% less calls than we had in 2019. So that's really significant. We had a huge lockdown, or a lot was closed, at least in 2020. We weren't forced to stay home really, but everything was closed and people were also quite hesitant. They weren't really looking forward to go to the hospital. So they didn't know if they would be really safe there from COVID. So they just didn't call for an ambulance. And if they also stayed at home, there were less accidents and all these things. But there are a lot of different reasons why these numbers decreased, and they're also influenced by behavior a lot. And we just don't know how the people will behave in the upcoming years. With now the energy crisis around the corner, it might be that we have a lot more people being in home office in winter again, maybe staying indoors instead of going out. We just don't know. But we still need to prepare for whatever happens. So this is what's currently really challenging. And besides the actual numbers, I also looked at a geographic difference in demand, because this is what will really influence our location planning, right? If we just have less demand, then ambulances might be less busy. So we could be fine with that. But if people actually are in different regions during the time, then demand will also occur at different places. And this might actually influence a lot if we are in time or if we need to relocate our ambulances. And so the blue areas indicate that we had an increase in demand, and the red areas that we had a decrease. And this is especially the case for city centers. So city centers were closed for quite some time in 2020. So people just didn't go there. Obviously, if there was nothing to do, no shops open, no restaurants open, why should they go there? So without people, there was less demand. And what I then just did is I built a network representation for this data and just solved the comparably simple maximum expected covering location model, which is not like the most sophisticated model out there, but it's really well known within the area, and also well used, and quite easy to implement and quite fast to solve. And what I could find out is that locations, so if I just use data from 2019 and if I just use data from 2020, I would end up with different location solutions. So it was significant. Also, the differences were significant enough to actually change our locations. So it's really crucial to think of your input data even more than they maybe did before, because we might just make wrong decisions about basis if we make the wrong assumptions about people behavior and expected demand in the future. This is like the first insight I wanted to give. And maybe because we can't be really sure, we don't really know what's happening, practice won't really be able to include all this all these new ideas very soon. One other idea that we should focus I think more closely on is if the ambulances might need to be late in certain incidents, or can't be there always as fast as we would want them to be. For example, when an out-of-hospital cardiac arrest happens, where we would want medical staff to be there within 3 or maybe at most 5 minutes to somehow ensure a high probability for recovery, which is just not possible for ambulances all over Germany. We could look closer at what we call pre-EMS services. So everything that helps the patient, that cares for a patient before the ambulances arrives. And this could be volunteers and first responders who go to the scene before the ambulance arrives. But it's also equipment, for example, automatic external defibrillators that we locate throughout our regions, or that could even be transported by drones to the scene. And this is what we looked at. So we did a survey on what's out there in pre-EMS services. So what people have been researching in the different fields. And what we realized is that hardly any people actually used simulation in a mathematical sense. There were a lot of like real world simulations about like how should volunteers do things, and can drones actually bring floating devices to drowning patients. So like really a drone flying to a person simulating a drowning, but hardly any OR simulation studies, which was really a significant insight for us, because it's something that we would have expected also first to demonstrate the potential impact of solutions, right? To demonstrate also the connections between pre-EMS and EMS services, but so far it's been hardly done. There were a lot of papers considering the location planning of defibrillators, but all just static. So within buildings or on the street, hardly any mobile ideas, which could actually increase the efficiency of defibrillators, because when you have to pick them up by foot, there's a reasonable radius of maybe 100 to at most 300 meters. So if you imagine even a city like Melbourne, if you needed a defibrillator every 300 meters, you would need really many of those, right? So couldn't it be also efficient in certain areas to use some form of mobile transport options for those defibrillators? Drones have been looked at a lot from more like a medical point of view, also from a statistics point of view. Not many operations research approaches for that. And overall, whatever we found within OR was more or less deterministic. Very few stochastic, robust, and multi-criteria approaches. And if you remember also what I said in the beginning, we have a lot of competing interests. So multi-criteria approaches should be something that we see as a standard there. And because we just don't know what happens, having stochastic or robust approaches should be something that should be more of interest to researchers. So what we started with was the idea to transport AEDs with drones, but to include that into the system. So not just saying, okay, how to locate the drones, but how to locate the drones so that we get a maximum additional impact to what we already have in the system. So, I mean, if we can reach a location within just very few minutes by ambulance, and there's no need for an additional drone, the ambulance can just do that. If we already have located static AEDs, we don't need a drone. It will be more efficient if a volunteer picks up the drone next door, the defibrillator next door. So we we looked at the problem also from a network perspective. We have demand nodes and flight times between the nodes, and also ambulance driving times, because we look at both. We have two sets of coverage for the ambulances and for the drones. With drones, they can fly, so we can also easily relocate them. So we look at periods and say, we know that people are are often traveling between parts of the city, right? So they might be at different areas on the weekends than they are during the week when they're at work. So it might be reasonable to also relocate the drones. We need a few limits on the number of drones, and we want to include the maximum response times. And we also want to limit the drone transfers and also maximum distance they transfer, just to make them available again as soon as possible. We include costs for the drones, fixed and variable. And we also include some form of reliability. So ambulances are not always available. They might already be busy with the call. So just because I have an ambulance within a 3-minute driving time radius, it doesn't mean that it's actually there when I need it, right? So it could be a way. And then just having the base there, wouldn't help me. Drones might not be able to fly at all times. If we have really strong winds, something that Wellington, for example, might in New Zealand might really struggle with. In Germany, the tests show that drones can be used really like most of the times. We have hardly situations where they couldn't be used. They can fly during the night, that's no issue. But we know regions worldwide where this might be more difficult. And with static ADs, even if they're close by, they might just not be visible, or they might be within buildings that are not accessible. So we end up with a bi-criteria optimization model where we want to maximize the covered demand, but at the same time, we want to minimize the costs. And we can only operate the drone from an open base station. We can only cover a demand node if we have a drone or an ambulance within the maximum response times, want to fulfill our limits. And we will use all drones at each period, because if we have installed them, there's no sense not using them. They can only be transferred once per period, and we can't. We have to fulfill the limits on the transfer numbers and distances, and then we have the domain constraints in the end. And we solve this problem with a dichotomic approach, because it's a bi-criteria problem, and applied it to the federal state of Hesse in Germany. As a proxy for the demand, we used the population density, because it's just not possible to get real demand from all the EMS regions that we have in Hesse. So we had to ask each and every one of them separately, not worth the work at the moment. So we used population density. We could access all the ambulance locations and determine their expected response times, and knew which points, which areas they could reach within a given time and which not. And what's also important is, because we're looking at drones, so we had to include restricted fly zones, especially airports. Frankfurt Airport is in Hesse, so that's something you might know about Germany. Quite huge, quite a large radius that would count as a restricted fly zone, which also means that Frankfurt might not be the city that's most appropriate to be covered by drones. But we included that also in such a way that for the distances that we calculated, that we flew around those restricted flight zones and included that into the matrix. We have a good connection to a German drone company that's located here in Darmstadt, which is really convenient for us. Their startup have developed a very promising drone. It's used worldwide already, so they're doing a great job. It has a range of 75 kilometers with a payload of 5 kg. We would never fly that far within a traveling time of like 3 to 5 minutes for a cardiac arrest anyway, so we don't really need to care about that. We could fly a couple of times even without recharging it, which is great. the default cruise speed is 100 kilometers per hour, but it can even go a lot faster already, and it's promising that it will be even faster in the future. So we can cover some distance within the few minutes that we have. Currently, we still need a drone pilot to operate those, but the pilot could operate up to 10 drones at the same time, and there's hardly a risk of having 10 cardiac arrests within a federal state in Germany. So we could even have the future one drone pilot probably for the whole of Germany covering those drones. Pilots could fly the drones manually or set them into automatic mode, which is good. And for the AD, we could either have the drone land so that a volunteer would pick it up, or we could even use a parachute option, so we wouldn't even lose the time of landing. We looked at different scenarios with different response times and cruise speeds, leading to the different coverage radius. And you see they're far below the 75 kilometer range that we have. We divided the week into 4 scenarios, basically differentiating between weekdays and the weekends and day and night, and used the set of costs that we got from our partners. And then I have just derived a set of results for the different scenarios. And what you see is that that wouldn't really be reasonable within a reasonable amount of drones to cover the whole state of Hesse, which is also because the northern part is quite rural. So drones are a lot more. So the expected benefit for drones is a lot higher, especially in semi-urban areas, where ambulances do need longer than the 3 to 5 minutes, but which are still where the population density is still high enough for drones to have a significant impact. But we can reach already with, for example, in the scenario of 3 minutes and 150 kilometers per hour, we only need 21 drones to cover 60% of our population, which is already, I think, quite promising in that sense. What was also important for us is to determine that we actually do have a significant decrease in response time, so that the amount of patients we can reach within the 3 or the 5 minutes increases significantly when we use drones compared to when we use ambulances. So I think this is also very good output from our scenarios, even only if we locate 24 drones in those scenarios. And I want to now go to a third planning problem that we have. Also something that's quite a service aspect, I would say. Something that we have within the German EMS system, our patient transports. So when we need to transport a patient to, from, or between a hospital, and the patient needs medical care or potentially medical assistance during the transport, then it's part of the EMS system, something that the coordination center dispatches, and we call that qualified patient transports. And we had around 5.4 million of those transports within Germany in 2020, so quite a high number. We have 80 million inhabitants in Germany, just to give you an idea about that. But then we also have patient transports, which are called unqualified transports. And those are done by taxi companies or other transportation providers. For example, if someone needs to be taken to a doctor for an appointment and can't take public transport for some mobility reasons, then a taxi would come and be paid by the German insurance company. And we had more than 37 million of those in 2020. So this is really a significant number. And these are all classic transport problems. So we can model those as a dial right problem. Spoiler alert, not done in Germany. So this is all done manually, especially the qualified patient transports are all assigned manually by dispatchers in the coordination center. Lots of effort that's actually not necessary. What we know about those tasks is that we have a pickup and drop-off locations, and we also have time windows. And we usually do know a significant number of transports up front. So there's a chance to actually also plan with them. But because we also have short-term demand, we will need a set of approaches actually for practice to be like really satisfied and like really applying those things. Just to give you like a quick visual idea how it works in Germany for the qualified patient transports, ambulances are located at a base where they start their route at the morning, and then they always pick up and drop off a patient. So we only have a capacity within the ambulances for one patient. So we would never pick up several patients first and then drop them off. So this is already, or this makes the scheduling already a lot easier than maybe for the combined transports. And if we look at the literature, if we also match that with practice, for the short-term demand, we could use online dispatching algorithms, which are simple and fast. The drawback is on the system-wide performance, but the positive aspect is that we can actually explain them to the dispatchers. So we made a study once with dispatchers if they would be willing to use and to apply operations research planning algorithms in their dispatching software, and they said yes, but they wanna still be able to understand the impacts of their decisions. They want to understand how the tool came up with a decision. So if we now start with a very advanced, complicated heuristic, or even with an exact approach that's also for us a bit of a black box, this might not lead to the highest rate of acceptance in practice. So we should be able to at least offer them a set of approaches that are that differ in the complexity and also in the explainability. And their online algorithms are very close also to how they dispatch the ambulances at the moment. There are a lot of different heuristics that we can apply towards the short-term demand, as well as to compute routes the day before. And if instances are small enough, we can also derive optimal solutions. Realistically, let's say up to maybe 40 or 50 tasks. I mean, we also don't want to invest in like huge computing power for these coordination centers. So realistically, we would use some form of heuristics, but of course could use the exact approaches for comparison purposes when developing those approaches. We have a lot of different objectives that are of interest. Most important are minimizing the driving times from a provider point of view, and minimize the lateness at the patient from a service point of view. But it also goes back to the provider, because currently a lot of hospitals actually ask for a lot earlier pickup time in order for the ambulance to be actually in time than for the actual pickup. But if the ambulance is now in time, they're often too early. So reducing the lateness will also increase the hospital's willingness to actually ask for the right pickup times. And then we can combine those. We can add something like a balanced workload for drivers, etc., as additional objectives. There's a good amount of literature on dial-a-ride formulations to be found for transports within hospitals that we can reuse. And a couple of researchers have looked at patient transports in Austria. That gives a good insight. And so we would end up with quite a similar dial-a-ride problem, where we minimize the distance and the lateness. We have to assign the tasks. We have to include constraints about the starting and ending the route and the flow conservation, and then making sure that we keep the time windows from all aspects, from all sides. A very easy heuristic that we could apply is the best insertion heuristic. I think this is something that's also very well known within operations research, where we basically have a set of routes and a list of our tasks, and then we try to assign each task to one route, so that we optimize our objective function, minimize or maximize our objective function. And what we can also do is, if we can't find a feasible position for a job because we would violate our time windows if they are fixed, then we would assign the task to a dummy ambulance, which could be then actually an emergency ambulance in practice in Germany. In the end, we would get a set of routes where all the jobs are assigned. And this is something we can also very easily explain to the dispatchers and the decision makers and show them how it works. And it's also very fast. And we use this as a basis for like a little bit more sophisticated approach, where we start with the best insertion heuristic, but we solve it a couple of times with different starting lists, because the order of the tasks, how we use them, influence the solution. That's just how the insertion heuristic works. So we get a lot of different routes by that. We also include different objectives to just derive many different routes, which are here represented by the columns. So we get a lot of different columns, a lot of different routes, and then use a set covering formulation to choose one route per ambulance to optimize our objective function value overall. And on top of that, we can then also use, for example, like a neighborhood search to further improve that. So we still use the easiness and the simplicity of the insertion heuristic, but improve that significantly by still something that's comparably easy and also fast. In order to test this approach, we built many different data sets now, which we're quite happy. Wasn't so easy in the beginning, but we are now convinced a couple of EMS regions to give us data and to collaborate with us. So this is just an example, one of the data sets where you can see how the transport requests also vary throughout the day. This is also something that's quite typical in Germany. We do have also quite often dialysis patients with quite fixed time windows, so there might also be an incentive to look at them more specifically, or make sure that those trips are definitely on time, and we might be a bit more generous with the time windows for, let's say, general transports. And out of those requests, we derived different instances of different sizes, also to check for solution times, to check for complexity and stuff, right? So the smallest instance has 24 transport tasks, something that's also still quite easily solvable with a standard solver like Cplex or Gurobi or so. So it makes it possible for us to compare the heuristic to the optimal solution. But we also have transport instances with up to 300 transports, not solvable optimally anymore. But yeah, which also gives us good ideas about large regions where we just have many transports. For some in Germany, it could be even more than 300 transports per day. Would also be actually quite a good idea to combine transport requests from different areas and to solve them on a larger scale. And this is what we designed the larger instances for. This is just an example. It's not like really representative of the actual solutions. We're currently rerunning everything with our new instances, but just to give you an idea how it does look. This was an instance with 32 tasks, so we could also solve the model optimally, the dial-right formulation that I showed you optimally. So we do get a nice Pareto curve for that. And we also get different Pareto solutions for the objective. So we could solve the set covering formulation also with a dichotomic approach to determine Pareto solutions for that. And so with the neighborhood search, we also get a lot closer to the optimal solutions. That is currently done, as I said. But it was also important for us to know, or to have is alternative solutions. I mean, in practice, we will end up with only one in the end, but being able to determine several solutions is just important for the acceptance of decision makers, to at least have them, or to at least have them know that there would be alternatives, alternative solutions if they just if they wanted to see them and if they wanted to decide between them. We looked at online planning, which is quite close to what the dispatchers are currently doing. If one ambulance becomes free, just assign the next job or assign the best job towards your objective from the next case. So include a look ahead. Not only including the look ahead, but only including the ambulances, still assigning just one job, or assigning at most one additional job to all available ambulances. And also with that, we could improve already what dispatchers in practice do, because I mean, computers can just compare more more potential solutions than a person really can do in their mind at the same time. So already with these very, very simple online assignment rules, we could improve the practical decision making. And so this is something we hope that at least will be useful in practice and usable. One last aspect, which I think will be important for us in the future, is that we can reasonably apply machine learning for different tasks and topics within the emergency medical service system. And if it's only predicting emergencies and having a better idea of our future demand, but all around the processes in the call taking and service on the instance side, we can improve a lot. We have looked at demand forecasting approaches, which we can do at the different levels. Not all as nice as we would want to. COVID did give us another concept drift, which is not very pleasant for the approaches, but still something that I think is worth working on. And we could also, for example, use it to decide about if to assign a helicopter, what we've done with St. John in New Zealand, which was really interesting. So also deciding on a service level when it is, when a patient would actually profit from a helicopter and when it would be a good idea from a service, but also from a monetary aspect. So with that, I would like to finalize my talk and would be looking forward to your questions. Thank you.